Haya manana mona he no wa ayo ya ne ni wa ya na. Haya manana mona he no wa ayo ya ne ni wa ya na. Hey haya manana moni wa ayo ni yo he no wa ayo na. Haya manana mona he no wa ayo ya ne ni wa ya na. Haya
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists and our attendees to the Parallel Worlds Project. My name is Carly Tex. I am the Executive Director for the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. Our mission is to foster the revitalization of California's indigenous languages. This project is made possible through our partners at the Manzanar National Historic Site, the Paiute-Shoshone Cultural Center, and funded by the California Civil Liberties Education Project through the California State Library. We would like to acknowledge the late Viola Martinez, who inspired the project with her book, California Paiute, Living in Two Worlds.
Okay.
And we would like to thank the panelists and moderators for all your work in preparing this presentation. With that, I would like to turn it over to Amra Keller for a blessing recorded by Jamie Meredith.
Nü nani shidahewe. Nija nigwa udavinga tsao sudusunek te paya a te dunapi a te da wob te hima nok tui hanu no vidu. Nija nira mabu adunga tsao no vidu we. Nira mabu adunga te dunapi a nigwa togo tsawa dui tiju. Nira mabu adunga nira kawa dui tiju. Ni ja'a nigwa nira mabu adunga nana takawa dui tiju. Mano.
Thank you, Amra, for sharing that clip. I would like to turn it over to Amra to share the Bakuhatsu Taiko Dan performance group with a recording to get us started.
Exciting. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeanne Ferris, and I'll be serving as moderator along with Amara Starr-Keller of the Nüümü tribe. And for this is a reminder that we use the term Zoom, but we are referencing all forms of video conferencing. And just a little bit about myself. I am a brand ambassador for the San Diego International Film Festival, and I'm an active member of the press corps in Los Angeles and San Diego, and I am a contributing writer for the magazine News from Native California. And I'd like to say how grateful I am to Taria Smith, editor extraordinaire, for introducing me to Marina Drummer, champion of civil liberties, who gave me this amazing opportunity to work with everyone here tonight. The fall issue of News from Native California will have an accompanying article to tonight's event. So please support your local magazines like News from Native California. So tonight's subject is, as we were all speaking prior to everybody tuning in, is about racism. And like the coronavirus, it's everywhere, and we have to be vigilant from being overtaken by this invader. 100 years ago, the Nüümü, also known as the Paiutes, and the Nui, also known as Shoshone, were forced to leave their ancestral home in Payaüünadü, which is also known as Owens Valley. They lost their land when they were imprisoned for 3 years, after which they were released. Many returned to Payaüünadü, but also experienced the same thing as the Japanese Americans who were imprisoned at Manzanar, which is on tribal land. 100 years later, which is why this Zoom event is called Parallel Worlds, both races have experienced the same thing, but the Japanese Americans were in a more compressed time than the Nüümüs and the Nuis. This is also, our next panelist is Ann Kaneko. She's a Fulbright scholar and a documentarian, and has created a beautiful film regarding Manzanar and the waters, the ancestral waters of the Nüümü and the Nui. Ann, can you hear me? Okay, good. I think you need to unmute yourself. There you go. Tell us about your journey in creating this film and what compelled you to create it.
First of all, I wanted to thank you all for having me on this panel. Making this film has been a very long journey. It's been over 4 or 5 years. I'm sure Bruce can attest to being pestered for many, many years. Kathy Bancroft, who I know has also been instrumental in organizing this, has also been, I have been her shadow for these years. But I think this film really came out of an exploration of the connections between Japanese American incarceration and thinking about the land, and also ties to indigenous people in Payaüünadü. I came to this story through a project with some researchers from UCR and UC Irvine, and I was really trying to find a different way of looking at the incarceration experience, but for the Japanese Americans. But I always knew that there was a deep connection between in the indigenous experience. Obviously, the forced removal of indigenous people from this country is the real precedence for what happened to Japanese Americans. I think in the context of the Muslim ban, when people were talking about the Japanese American experience, I always look to the indigenous experience as well as the African American experience of being brought to this country forcibly. So it was this connection of trying to understand what these relationships and connections between these communities were, and then also how Los Angeles and the fact that it is the source of this land has given of its water to Los Angeles. And it was really, for me, this journey of trying to put these different stories together and understand both part of my own history, since my parents and grandparents were incarcerated, but also to learn about my own responsibilities as a third generation person from Los Angeles. And so it's become this kind of poem or ode to Payahüünadü.
I love that. And we're going to see a little clip of your film, which you are in the process of editing, correct?
Yes.
And you'll be submitting it to Sundance?
Hopefully, all depending on what happens to Sundance.
Everything is depending on everything.
Yeah, the film is a much longer feature that focuses on sort of the land and water, and it looks through these communities that have been impacted by this relationship, this complicated relationship that Los Angeles has with this valley, and the devastation that it's, you know, that has become a result of the Los Angeles dewatering this valley. So, you know, the clips that I'm showing today are really focused on kind of these intersections between the Japanese American and Native American communities, but the film is a much larger piece about this history and these communities as well as water.
Okay. Amara, can you upload the film, the little clip?
Yes, uploading the film.
Okay. Nice.
There's stories about things that happen here, but nobody listens.
They had come from another country, had all kinds of obstacles placed in front of them, and yet were able to survive.
My people, my ancestors, my grandparents have lived on this lake for thousands of years. Outsiders came into this valley and renamed it. We called it Payaüünadü, which means the place where the water always flows. When the outsiders came, they brought in herds of cattle and they trampled all their food supplies. So there was conflict, and then when they were hungry, they would kill a cow. They took all the Indians and tried to get us out of the valley, marched us down by Fort Totsahoidu, and we made our way back, most of us. My great-grandmother made it back by herself as a little girl. I always think about that, how important this place was to her.
I was evacuated from Los Angeles on May 9th, 1942. We were sent to the Manzanar concentration camp. The period I spent in Manzanar was the most traumatic experience of my life. It has influenced my perspective as well as my continuing efforts to educate, persuade, and encourage others of my generation to speak out about the unspeakable crime.
Manzanar is one little tiny square mile of land that has a deep history of forced removal, and that can be forced removal to this place, like the government did with Japanese Americans, or from this place, like the government did with the Owens Valley Paiute.
The part that I remember the most was seeing them coming in. You could see this long line of cars just coming up the highway. And as they came by, they had like suitcases and pillows and blankets just tied everywhere to the car. Car dealerships throughout the valley came to Manzanar. and bought all the cars at $10, $20. I don't know what it was. Yeah, you pray on with the weak. That's what you do. It's like watching another vanquishment. I don't know. It's just like we know we had our place to live, and I guess that's where they're going to go to where they have to live now. And I thought, God, what a terrible way to treat people. But then they say, well, they did that to us, and when they drove us across the mountain, yeah, it's the same thing, I guess.
Not once was I ever told, don't take too long a shower. Once I turned all of the 10 spigots on, because I thought, I'm in here by myself, I'm going to turn them all on. And I'd go running back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes I'd be in there half an hour just playing under the water.
Not only was water a major factor in the siting of Manzanar in the Owens Valley, because where else could you put a war camp without water? Water was also the means of resistance. And so it was the same vehicle that people behind barbed wire used to tell their stories, whether they were etching it in the concrete of the water reservoir with their fingertips, or with the beautiful, amazing gardens. And so water became, for me, this metaphor both of the oppression, but also the resistance to that.
People just got together collectively and really tried to make things better for everybody else. So gradually people began to decorate with stones and ordered fish and built fish ponds.
I know after a while some of the younger men would leave camp to go trout fishing. This was a lot that went on. We just did it quietly. The sentries are out there, but my father always spoke to them, and he would explain to them why we were going out of the camp.
A lot of Indian people assisted the Japanese people in going fishing because a lot of Indians worked in that area and probably developed friendships, you know. And if I know my people, they had a good sense of humor. That's one thing we're always taught that continued us to be strong no matter everything, the forced march, the treatment of the people that came into this valley. Never lose your sense of laughter, of being who you are as a person.
My father was loading watermelons on the train out here. He said he'd never seen so many watermelons in his life. He was hitchhiking home, and sheriff picked him up. And then he started asking him all these questions, and Dad was like, that's really weird. And it wasn't until he dropped him off and he goes, he thought I was from the camp because they didn't know him.
What I knew was desert before, and after they had developed it, it was just gorgeous. It was just transformed from night to day. It was a garden spot.
And could happen again. It takes people who at least can have some understanding of the past in order that it doesn't get repeated.
Unmute yourself, Jeanne.
Oh, there you go. That's a switch. I'm muting myself. I really enjoyed your film, and I can't wait for it to be finished and out there so that everybody knows these stories and hears about them.
Thank you.
Bruce, are you there? Would you like to welcome Bruce Embrey, co-chair of Manzanar Committee? Please, would you like to weigh in on that film, seeing as how she shadowed you?
Yeah, she's done an amazing job. I think drawing out the commonalities and our connection to the land, though Ours may only have been for a very short period of time. There, I think, is a very deep connection to the land. And I think the issue that has defined the valley for many years, I believe, is the struggle to preserve its integrity and its beauty. And I think against not the outsiders, and I think most recently being the Department of Water and Power. And I think the issue of what the Department of Water and Power has done in terms of taking the resources from that valley and diverting it to Los Angeles is something that we all should be very aware of and be cognizant about, and also struggle against, so that there can be more awareness of the need to preserve the water for the valley itself.
Yeah,
it's a great film. She did a great job.
Yeah. Tell us how Manzanar Committee is helping to preserve the memories of everybody that was incarcerated there.
Well, we're one of many. I think one of the most important developments, and I think it's important at this moment to think about how Manzanar and the Manzanar National Historic Site was actually built. I think it's an important story, because at this moment, while we're debating and struggling over monuments and naming sites and issues of racism and how this country's history should be remembered and preserved, I think this is, our story is very important story to add to the dialogue, and I think it's actually a positive story. And so my mother actually was incarcerated in Manzanar while she was 19 for a couple of years, and she returned to Manzanar in 1969, and along with a number of younger Sansei or third generation Japanese Americans. And I think they all knew once they were there how important it was and how the story itself needed to be preserved. So I think it's the story that we really have worked on keeping alive, keeping the story in front and center to the country's consciousness. And I think the individual stories are so important to that. There are so many that have passed already, but there are many really important oral histories. And I think the Manzanar National Historic Site has done an incredible job with very limited resources and against all odds in some ways to help preserve the individual stories of many of the survivors of camp. So we do our part, and I think we should also give credit to the National Park Service and the Manzanar National Historic Site for being the repository for many of these stories.
Do you have some photographs you would like to share with the audience?
Yes, I really am honored to be here. I think this is as I mentioned, an extremely important time in our history to be discussing how our country's history needs to be remembered and needs to be told. And so I thought, rather than talking about the general story, I'd like to speak more about my mother's history and how she, as a second generation Japanese American, got involved, why she got involved, and how the Manzanar National Historic Site actually came to be. She's been called a number of things, most affectionately Mother of Manzanar, and given a lot of credit for the site being established. And it took decades to get the site to where it is today. And I wanted to go through some of that history and try and touch on what she did, what her life experiences were, and how they led her to help build Manzanar, which really did take an entire community to build. So if we could show the slides, that'd be great.
Yes, I'm working on that, Bruce, but while we are queuing that up, we have a question for when the release date of the movie will be. And if you could answer that for us. And we just have a couple comments if you didn't see on the slide. People are chatting, and using the question and answer box. So beautiful film. We appreciate it. Can't wait to see the live. And so if you could answer when the release date of the movie will be, or give us.
We expect to finish it. We're trying to wrap it up this year, and then hopefully, release it in the spring of next year. So, but it's a little bit challenged right now, given COVID and the quarantine, how festivals will be dealing with screening things. So we're trying to, everything's a little iffy.
Okay. Is there a way we could get to that first slide? It was captures my mother's family. It's a photograph of my mother's siblings, actually, the whole. Oh, there you go, that one. So my mother's the the one on the right hand, as you're facing the photograph, the right hand side, with the little rice bowl haircut and that little dress standing up on the corner. So my mother was born and raised in Los Angeles, in the little Tokyo community of Los Angeles. And she had 7 brothers and sisters. And they were a very typical Japanese-American family. My mother's Nisei. Nisei means second generation. Her mother and father were Issei, or the Japanese immigrants. And my grandfather had a trucking business, a small trucking business. And tragically was killed in an automobile accident when my mother was just a teenager. And so she watched her mother become the sole breadwinner of the family. And I think this had a huge impact on the kind of person my mother grew to be. She had to pitch in very early, at a very young age, to help keep the family going. And at the time of when war broke out, she was working with my grandmother in a small grocery store, trying to keep the family going. And growing up, my mother loved school. She was a very inquisitive person, and she wanted nothing more than to be a writer. She wanted to major in English literature, actually, and be a writer. And she expressed this at a very young age. And her father said to her when she was a preteen that it was a pipe dream, and that she had 2 strikes against her. 1, she was Japanese, and 2, she was a woman. And he believed that she should never even attempt to go to college. We can go to the next slide. The admonishment stayed with her entire life. And when she did graduate from college, she actually referenced that memory. When war broke out, my mother was 19, and they had to sell their grocery store for pennies on the dollar, like most Japanese American families. They lost just about everything. They did have a car, and as Beverly mentioned in the film, they lost the car, actually, when they were in Manzanar, and I don't believe they got anything for it. But they had the store and the car, and they were basically forced to sell them both for pennies on the dollar. And when she arrived in Manzanar, she immediately set out trying to make things work. And she got a job sewing camouflage nets. The Kunotomis were a very patriotic family, very did anything they could to support the war effort. And she ends up sewing camouflage nets, but then pursuing her dream, she actually ends up working at the local Manzanar Free Press, and that's her in this picture. She's right in the middle of that photograph. And so she becomes a cub reporter for the Free Press, and she eventually becomes the editor of that newspaper. You can go to the next slide, please. She left Manzanar after not even 2 years, about 19, 20 months into it. She was determined to leave and get out, and just couldn't believe that her family and her community was incarcerated. So she managed to get out with the help of some religious organizations, and she ended up in Madison and eventually in Chicago. In Chicago, she went to work for the public library, the Newberry Library in downtown Chicago, which is an amazing institution that's still there. And that also was part of her lifelong dream to be a writer and an English lit major. So she was pretty much in this environment that she found quite stimulating and fascinating. And she had never really interacted, much less worked closely with people from other communities. So it was a first time for her to actually work very closely with Caucasian and African-American co-workers. And while she was in Chicago, she realized that reflecting back, and as a writer, both a columnist and as an editor of the Free Press from outside of camp, she had a lot of time and energy to reflect on what had happened to her and her community. And one of the things she realized while there was that the Japanese American community was an extremely cohesive community. It was vibrant socially. It had temples and churches. It had thriving businesses. The Japanese had managed to establish an incredible thriving toehold in both agriculture and in fishing in California. So she said, our community was not just socially cohesive, it was economically viable, but yet they rounded us all up in a very short period of time, took away everything we had and locked us up in concentration camps. And she marveled at why that could be. And I think what she realized then was we were a largely immigrant community and young community, and we had no political power. We had no allies. We had no clout. And she felt that that was why the Japanese American community was rounded up, and that no one spoke out, that no one felt compelled to defend their constitutional rights and their rights to be full rights of citizenship in the United States. And she felt that was a really important lesson. In 1948, my grandmother and family were struggling to get resettled in Los Angeles. When they left camp, they only had $25 and a bus ticket, one-way bus ticket. So it was very difficult for many families to get established. And my uncles, who three of whom would just come out of the U.S. Army, two of my uncles were in the military intelligence service, were struggling to get their own families established. So my mother returned to Los Angeles to help my grandmother get established. And once she got here, she found herself in the midst of a very large, once again, unlike Chicago, very large and vibrant Japanese American community. And she immediately became active politically. She acted on that realization from Chicago. And she joined a group in Los Angeles that was nationwide. It was called the Nisei Progressives. And this is a picture of Henry Wallace, who was a candidate for president, along with the Nisei Progressives of Los Angeles. The Nisei Progressives included some prominent intellectuals like the famous sculptor Isamu Noguchi and a number of other people. You can go to the next slide. And they formed a group called Nisei for Wallace, and he was an independent candidate for president of the United States. And you can see these signs here. This is in the late 1940s, 1948. And they're asking for redress and reparations. That's the indemnities. And they also wanted to strike down the repressive and anti-immigrant laws that governed the United States. In fact, at that time, their anti-miscegenation law still existed. California had an anti-miscegenation law that banned people of color from marrying whites all the way through 1948. Her mother, my grandparents, could not become citizens. They could not own land. So they called for citizenship for their parents, and obviously no more Hiroshimas. They worked locally here in Los Angeles. They worked to elect Ed Roy Ball, the first Mexican-American congressman. And they, as I mentioned, campaigned against nuclear war and for nuclear disarmament because of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can go to the next slide, please. My mother remained active in the Democratic Party for her entire adult life. Here she's on stage with Jesse Jackson running for president. Wallace campaign in 1948 was very similar to the Jesse Jackson campaign of 1984. And she worked on many local campaigns as well, including the campaign for Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles. She served on the LA Commission on the Status of Women, eventually becoming the chair of that commission. And in 1980, she was appointed to the U.S. delegation, appointed by Jimmy Carter, to the U.S. delegation to the second United Nations Conference on Women. That was one of her proudest moments. So I say all of this simply to show and give you a sense of her activism before the 1969 Manzanar pilgrimage. She had a lifetime of civil rights and political organizing that went all the way back to the 1940s. And I believe this is what enabled her and the Manzanar Committee to be successful in achieving and building the Manzanar National Historic Site. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in 1969, my mother returns to Manzanar, this time voluntarily. She is there along with a number of young student activists, primarily, who, inspired by the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, were beginning to seek their own identity and were engaged in struggles for ethnic studies and equity and parity in not just education, but in housing and economic and job security as well. So in 1969, largely spurred on by the civil rights movement and also the anti-Vietnam War movement, a number of young third and fourth generation Japanese Americans, Sansei and Yonsei, organized the Manzanar pilgrimage. And as Warren Furutani, one of the principal organizers, put it, he said they were looking for somewhere to march to that had some meaning to who they were. So in 1969, about 200 people show up. It's in December. And anyone who had been in camp knew that that was not the best time to return. But nevertheless, they went and they endured the freezing cold up there, very windy. And they set about cleaning up the site, and they listened to some speeches, including one from Edison Uno, who many refer to as the father of redress, who was a Japanese American Citizens League member, and he had been advocating for redress and reparations for many years, and he was essentially the keynote speaker at that pilgrimage. My mother also spoke, as well as a very amazing young man, Jim Matsuoka, and a former incarceree from Manzanar, a labor activist named Carl Yonetta also spoke. And my mother and Jim spoke to the press. The press had shown up, and they were very curious about what were you doing in this site. And since not many people had spoken about camp or really gone into any detail about what life was like behind barbed wire with their kids, my mother and Jim were tasked to speak to the press. And once they did, literally all hell broke loose. They talked about why it had happened, and also sort of described life behind barbed wire. And they didn't exactly mince words, and many in the community were very upset that someone dared raise such an ugly chapter, and feared that anti-Japanese, anti-Asian racism would rear its ugly head again. And they discovered that they weren't exactly the most, they weren't greeted with open arms by many in the community at that time period. But they also discovered once there that this wasn't the first pilgrimage to Manzanar, that for some 23 years, 2 ministers had been coming to Manzanar, one Buddhist, one Christian, who would come to Manzanar and pray for those that were not able to make it home. And Reverend Maeda, who was one of the ministers from the Gardena Buddhist Church, said, he said, it's funny, we got there and they wouldn't let us in. He said, just a few years earlier, they wouldn't let us out, and now they won't let us in. So they were very moved by the fact that, they were able to return and join the ministers in that. Can we go to the next slide? This is my mother speaking, and I just want to kind of wrap it up here. This is Yuri Kochiyama on stage, and two other women from around the country. They had Manzanar committees in San Francisco, Chicago, and in New York. And Yuri Kochiyama is a famous activist from New York City, and she's kind of in the middle of the three women sitting there. So they were a nationwide committee working hard to get Manzanar established. So. This is a very important year. In 1972, the committee managed to achieve state landmark status, and they got the state to recognize Manzanar as a landmark. And this is important for two reasons. One is it was the first time that government at any level had recognized any confinement site, any camp or confinement site, Department of Justice confinement site. And that was the first time that any site from that period was recognized as an unjust and essentially illegal, unconstitutional site. And the other significance of that plaque, we could go to the next slide, shows the plaque, which is that this plaque, which still sits in front of Manzanar today, along with the shotgun blast and the axe attack that tried to chisel off the words racism. This plaque actually captures what happened at Manzanar and the other various confinement sites around the country, that it was based upon racism and economic greed, as well as ineffective political leadership. And I think those are really important words because they lasted all the way through to the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Those same words were used to describe the apology that Ronald Reagan signed in 1988, apologizing for forced removal of the Japanese American community. So language is important, terms are important, and it's important, I think, for communities of color to define their own terms and define their own language and not use the euphemisms that our government has chosen to describe our experiences. Did you want to leave it there, or should I keep going?
I really appreciate you. We really appreciate you sharing your photographs and your mother's story, which is absolutely critical to today's climate. I think this would be a great place to segue to Ms. Murielle Tsukamoto. She is a retired educator and also a concentration camp survivor from Jerome, correct?
Yes, Jerome, Arkansas. And I want to share some photographs also. Is it possible to bring that up? I have it. Can you see it?
Murielle, you'll need to share your screen.
Oh, here it is. Okay. No, my grandparents came, the grandparent on the left came from Okinawa in 1893. Grandparent on the right came from Hiroshima in 1890. So they were here early. And like many immigrants, they ended up, one ended up in Hawaii and then worked his way over to San Francisco, and the other ended up in actually Vancouver. And by the 1920s, more and more immigrants were coming. But the story of the Japanese immigrants is typical of most immigrants, and unfortunately also typical of the indigenous people. They were not treated fairly. There was racism, there was prejudice. So as Bruce mentioned, his grandparents were not allowed citizenship. Actually, until 1954, they were not allowed citizenship. And because of that, they were not allowed to purchase land. They came hoping And I show this picture because see Lincoln in the back? Many Japanese homes had either a statue or picture of Abraham Lincoln. Oh my goodness, why? Because Lincoln was born in a log cabin, came from poverty, as many immigrants do. And he rose to be president of the United States and freed the slaves. What better land could you come to than a land that offered opportunity like that? And that is the immigrant story, isn't it? Coming here, hoping to be welcomed and to create a better life. Well, we did have a farm. That's my dad in 1941. And about 90% of the people in the town where I lived, which is Florin, California, 9 miles south of Sacramento. And by the 1930s, many of the farmers on the West Coast were becoming more affluent. Who's mentioned that? The communities were solid. 90% of the residents in Florin were Japanese, but no political power. And the other thing, even though, you know, my parents both born here, are American citizens, they went to school, they went to high school, my mom went to college, they didn't understand that they were a real American. They were true Americans. They always were treated as second-class Americans, and this was before the Civil Rights Movement. No political power. In fact, after Pearl Harbor, the executive order was signed, and the California legislature voted to send the Japanese off the West Coast. There were 2 votes. Ralph Dills from Torrance, California voted no. And why did he vote no? As a young man, his father died. He lived on, his father had been the foreman of a very wealthy Japanese farmer. And this Japanese farmer said, Ralph, you're a very smart young man, I will pay your way to college. He voted no against sending the Japanese off the West Coast. The other person that voted no was John Shelley, who grew up in San Francisco with Japanese friends, and he understood. But everybody else in the legislature, all the politicians, wanted to get us off the West Coast. There were other groups too, politically strong and active groups, the Farm Bureau, the Farm Grange, because they saw the Japanese farmers and the Japanese businesses as competing in the economy. I'm going to show, we didn't come in cars because the people in Los Angeles were allowed to drive their cars from LA to Manzanar. We went by train, and look, 120,000 of us off the West Coast, and you had to sort of pack what you could carry. So if it didn't fit in one of those bundles, you didn't get to take it. You didn't know how long we were going to be gone. Half of us were children. 70% of us, American citizens. And yes, this is the one, I'm a teacher. I show this slide, and the children all cry because no pets. My grandmother didn't believe she would come back alive. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know how long we would be gone. We only knew we didn't have any power. And even though there were groups like the Japanese American Citizens League, it had no power. But they tried to keep people safe and say, look, if we resist, we think there will be physical danger to us. And so we were afraid to speak out. And I'm not sure that we understood our civil rights. It was before the civil rights movement, and we didn't say anything. You heard stories of how the first residents in some cases were horse stalls. That's true. That's me. And you can tell I wasn't happy. Can you imagine 120,000 people in 10 camps between 8 and 10,000 people? Half the residents were children, and we were all upset and crying. Notice the dark section. That's called the 3rd Army's military zone. And only if you lived in that specific area did you have to leave. If you lived anywhere else, half of Oregon and Washington, Nevada, part of Arizona, you didn't have to go. My camp was in Arkansas, clear across the country. We went there by train. Tule Lake is the other camp in California, Manzanar and Tule Lake. That's my camp to roam. And we lived in barracks, 120 feet long. There was no water in any of in these rooms. There was what they call the mess hall and the laundry and the bathroom facility in the middle of the block. If you could see the road, you could see that's one block. 300 people to each block, 1 square mile. The average camp was 8,000 to 10,000 people. You saw this. There was no furniture except a bed. They gave you a bed. And of course, there were lines. And what was the most difficult, I was 5 and I'm a child and I don't remember that much, but I remember my cousins who were teenagers. And I'm sure Sue Embrey also felt that way. The humiliation of having to use facilities like that. But we were in Arkansas and the people on the outside of the camp didn't have flush toilets. They didn't have electricity. And so they looked at our camp, and we were called chaps, and said, look at that. They get food, they have electricity, they have a house, and flush toilets. And so it was an unpopular position to be in, and you could see how some people would feel. The government allotment for food was 38 to 48 cents per person per day. In Gila, Arizona, hospital records show that the infant mortality rate was 50%. Women who were pregnant had miscarriages, stillborns. Infants didn't last very long because the conditions were so harsh. This probably looks a little bit like what Manzanar might have looked like if it was dry and windy, the sand blew all over it. And I'm sure, Bruce, your mom might have talked to you about having the sand go in your ears, your nose, and in your food. But people did the best they could. The community was strong and resilient. And I'm showing this because it's called the Children's Village. And Manzanar had a place called the Children's Village because John DeWitt did not believe in leaving any person with 1/16 or 1 drop of Jap blood on the West Coast. He took children out of orphanages in Los Angeles and put them inside the Children's Village. I think there was about 100 of them. We had schools. And of course, the parents did their best to make what was tolerable for us. But I share this story, and as a teacher, I know that we have a history of not being just and kind to everyone. And I can't think of a group that has suffered more than the Native Americans. I talk about this, and I certainly will add some of the things that I learned today about the Indian experience, because if we are going to prevent this from happening, and history repeats itself, we must educate the children and the teachers of the future. And I want to credit the staff at Manzanar for all of the programs that they have. And the documentary that you are producing is most important because it tells the story, and kids learn and people learn from seeing documentaries and what they see online. And this Zoom opportunity is an educational moment. And I commend all of you who have planned this so carefully, because you are contributing to telling a story, both stories of the Native Americans and the Japanese, and every immigrant that's come through has a story. And we need to become more fair, more just, but more importantly, we need to honor the Constitution. We in the United States have the only constitution in the whole world with a Bill of Rights. No other constitution has that. We have a specific section called the Bill of Rights, and we are not fulfilling all aspects of it yet. But how can we, if we as the people of the United States not only do not understand our rights as citizens, but don't have a voice? And Bruce, your mom was smart. She became politically active because we now know that is one of the best ways to protect our rights, is to become political active, to make the laws, to have people in positions of making decisions that will be fair. So I thank you for the opportunity of participating in this very important panel.
Thank you, Murielle. You're a very eloquent speaker. I bet your students loved you with your stories.
Thank you, thank you.
I would like to introduce our next panelist, Gerald Howard. He is a former tribal chairman and a retired educator of 34 years, a history teacher in Bishop. Am I right, in Bishop, Gerald?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Tell us about your experiences of teaching history during this time. Back then,
Sure.
Not this time, back then.
About teaching history in the classroom over this particular period?
Yes.
It was, the one thing about teaching is that it gives you a great deal of creativity. I mean, you have a classroom and you have a subject, but then how you want to present that and get that information to your students, that's kind of the exciting part, at least for me as a teacher. And when we would go and cover this particular period, we would kind of look at the general facts of what was taking place, in 1941 and 42. And some of the things that we would uncover, we would find that, from the discrimination that was taking place in California prior to that, where Japanese Americans were very successful as farmers in the state. And I recall looking at and reading about property values, and the property values for Japanese Americans in California was like triple that of other farmers. So what they were doing in agriculture was done very well, very efficiently, and it was very profitable. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me when I was looking through this material was that many California farmers despised that, and they really they did not like those Japanese American farmers being so successful, and they despised them for that. And I think that was a contributing factor that led to this forced relocation. But we would go through that and cover that material, and we would get into debates on the pros and cons of this relocation order. And one of the things in terms of in some of the debates, they would give you, the students would find material about why, if we're at war with the Japanese, but we're also at war with the Germans and the Italians, why weren't the Germans and the Italians rounded up and relocated? And then so it becomes a racial thing, because you cannot really identify the Germans or the Italians except for their surnames, but you could identify Japanese Americans. But we would go through these debates and look at the pros and cons. And so we did that. And another part of covering this particular period, I do interviews, and I have the students go out and find people that were alive at that time, and they would do interviews and ask them questions. And what was interesting is some of the material that came back, a lot of a lot of the people that were interviewed, eventually, you know, they came to not like that relocation policy. But at that particular time, they always kind of relied on this military necessity idea. And, you know, I think kind of over time, more and more people began to realize that it was a bad move on the part of the United States, especially with U.S. citizens. And one of the things, too, that came up was the fact that if the government was going to do this properly, they would have instituted martial law that would have covered the West Coast or the entire country. Then people would have lost their civil rights in general. And then the government could do what they wanted, but they never did that on the West Coast. So, I mean, there was a violation there of civil rights. But that whole period, then we'd take field trips down to Manzanar and take a look. And I hadn't been down there in a while, and I went last week, and it's such a small place. You know, when you really kind of go around the area and think that there are 10,000 people living on this small plot of land. And I was there when the temperature was about 100 degrees, and it gets pretty stifling down there. And then you think of the wind and the sand, and you know, my aunt was saying that when she was raised in Lone Pine, just south of there, but she said when she was a young girl and she would go by there, she just thought how miserable it was to be, you know, in that concentration camp and with all those people, and it just seemed kind of miserable to her. But
can you explain to us how it was growing up as a Nüümü? Your experience,
well, you know, we were
as a tribal chairman, and
well, you know, I was born and raised here, and you know, attended public schools, and you know, the one thing I think that's a really strong parallel between the Japanese American experience at Manzanar and then at the other camps, and then with the Nüümü here in Payahüünadü, is at some point you always kind of feel that you're a foreigner in your own land, you know, like you're an outsider, and that always was kind of, it was, sometimes it could be overt, but other times not. But you could, as a young kid, you could kind of feel that, you know, when you went into, you know, non-native communities. You know, the reservations here in the valley are fairly small, and they're close to the non-native populations. So you kind of always knew where the community was, the reservation was, and when you went off the reservation, when you went into the white communities, you knew you were kind of you were an outsider. And so you kind of understanding that, and understanding that, you know, the school system, and at that time for most native, probably 99% of the native students at that time in the public school system, they had two routes for students, at least at the high school level. And that was either you were college bound or non-college bound. And if you were not, and most natives were non-college bound, so then you just took the basic subjects, the very elementary, simple subjects, just to hopefully give you a graduation diploma. And so you kind of always felt that too within the school system, that there's this segregation or discrimination, but it's not like it used to be, but it kind of was still there. They're just kind of sending you in certain directions that chances are probably most native students, if they did receive a high school diploma, then they hopefully they could get a job, and that would be that. You know, nothing to really kind of push students to do more. And so you kind of always felt that in the communities, and the one thing when I was thinking about all of the plaques, the historical plaques, like there's a historical plaque that's up on the road going up Bishop Creek, and it talks about this battle, the Battle of Bishop Creek between the Nüümü and the white settlers, and it goes on to say, we, from that particular time in 1861 and 1862, we don't remember what caused this conflict, and then it's like, what do you mean you don't know what caused this conflict? You know what caused the conflict. It was over land and it was over water. I mean, people were being displaced during that period. And so we know exactly why, but a lot of times in dominant history, there's an attempt to kind of erase all of that negativity, and that it was something that was just for whatever, there was a justification for whatever, that the early settlers in the valley did to the native population. It was okay. But I mean, that was kind of a common theme throughout American history. And I think, it's important for everyone to really know their history. Their history is, gives them a sense of direction and understanding of who they are, and if you don't have that, you just kind of wander and you're kind of lost. But being here in the valley, you always kind of felt that you were kind of a second-class citizen, and you were you weren't really going to amount to much. Hopefully you would just kind of stay out of the way and not cause any problems. But it's after from that whole period beginning in 1913 or 1905, when LA was started to acquire the water rights and the land, what they really wanted at that time was just to move the native population out of this valley to someplace else, so that they wouldn't have any problems and they could acquire everything that they wanted. And so we've always been, we fought that, and we were able to stay, even though we're on very small parcels of land. And we keep, the hope is that at some point we could acquire additional land holdings along with water rights. And one of the things I was looking at, some of the early documents in dealing with LA, DWP, in 1937, they offered up this land exchange which set up 3 reservations in the valley. And the legislation that was passed in Congress in April of 1937 said that the federal government would be giving up land and water, and LA would be giving up land and water in this exchange. And that's what the legislation said. And that was in April of 1937. And then I went back and I looked at one of the requirements in the legislation, said that a majority of Native people had to sign on to approve of this. So they went around with this kind of like a petition, having Native people sign in, saying that they approved of this. But in the paragraph that was explaining this, it said that in the land exchange, you would get land for land, but LA would guarantee water in perpetuity. So they weren't giving up their water rights. But that was in the legislation. So it was just, Native people historically have always been taken advantage of, and probably the people at that time in 1937 had no idea what the actual legislation said and what they were actually signing on to. But in the end, there was this land exchange throughout the valley, and we have these 3 small reservations in the valley, and with no water rights. We're guaranteed water, but then that's always kind of manipulated by DWP. But living here, I kind of think over time, I think LA was thinking, that eventually things would get so bad here in the valley economically for Native people that they would just kind of voluntarily move someplace else. And so I think that was kind of one of the reasons why they set up these reservations that's on such small parcels of land and with limited water, that eventually there was no future here, and people would filter out to Bakersfield, or they would go to Southern California, they would go someplace else, and then they would have all of the land on the valley floor for whatever they wanted, especially for the water. So it's been tough, you know, when you look back at the history of this valley. When the settlement came in 1861, we were pretty isolated. But if you've been here in this valley, it's a very narrow valley, very deep valley. The river runs right through the center of the valley, and so when settlement came, there was really no place for people to go. I mean, they had to stay here, unlike other Native people in other places throughout America could move to other locations. You know, people here were here. This was their home, and they were here, and they just had to deal with it. And I recall reading some papers in 1876 at the centennial, and they sent people out from the Smithsonian to gather information on Native populations, and they came to the Owens Valley, and they said, well, there really wasn't much to gather here. I mean, so there was a couple of things that took place. The people were so devastated in a very short period of time, or, you know, people just didn't, you know, they had enough, and they really didn't want to talk to too many outsiders. But it's been tough, and over that course of the mid to late 1800s, there's a lot of things lost. You know, we were on the forced march in 1863. Came back. People worked for local farmers and ranchers, and I mean, just thinking back, there's probably so much that was lost in a very short period of time, and so it's kind of a struggle to try and rebuild all of those things, you know, since then. But this has been my home, and it's a very beautiful place, and I can't think of any other place to live, and so
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Gerald, I would like to bring on your friend Monty. He wasn't able to get the video on, but he is calling in, and he is the Nüümü Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And Monty, can you hear us? I think we need to unmute you. Is Monty available? Carly, is Monty available?
I'm not sure.
Hello?
Let me try to get a hold of him. Oh, there he is.
Hi, Monty. Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for calling in.
Yeah, thanks for setting me up to be part of this pretty...
Could you give us your thoughts or your perspective on how you're revitalizing the Nüümü language? Oh, you've gone. Having little technical difficulties. Monty, oh, there he is. Can you hear me, Monty? Checking. Hello, Monty. I don't know. I think, Gerald, you may be in the hot seat again.
Always the late senator.
Oh, there you are.
And, I also emailed something on the late.
It's in and out. It's not consistent. Monty, can you hear me? It would have been great to get his perspective on the Nüümü language and how we're revitalizing it. Perhaps we can address some of the questions that are coming in on the Q&A. Carly, do you want to answer some of the questions or read them and then we can answer them?
We have some questions coming in from the audience that I was hoping the panelists could answer. We had a question for the Paiute panelists of, can you recall the conversion of tribal land to government purposes? We have another question of, what is the relationship like between the Nüümü of Payahüünadü and the Nisei today?
You know, I'm not on the first question. How was that tribal land converted to government land? Was that the question on that? Well, you know, it really was that it's going back to the 1800s and the wars of 1862 and 1863. It was just a matter of conquest. But you know, one of the things that's happened in 1887,
Hi,
they had
we could hear you for. Oh, sorry.
They had the Dawes Act, which set up this allotment system across the country. So Native Americans could. It was like the Homestead Act for Native Americans, and so you could get parcels of land that if you worked. I think it was for 10 years, the land would become your private property. And so just about every reservation in the United States had an allotment system. And what the allotment system did, though, on the negative side, was that it reduced the size of the reservations. And so that land that wasn't available for allotments then just went to the general public for homesteading. So I mean, so there was, you know, in a way there was a kind of a positive thing in the sense that somebody could actually have their own property, but then at the expense of the tribe, you lost a lot of property. But in the valley, we didn't have reservations here during that 1887 period. So, but under the legislation, it said that as long as you were a Native American, you could apply for an allotment. So there was federal land here that was formerly tribal land, and you could apply for it, and you could get an allotment from 40 acres to 80 acres. And so there are a number of tribal members that actually had allotments throughout the valley. But in the 1920s, with LA, DWP, they came in and they offered money for those allotments. And so people, the majority of people sold their allotments to LA. And then once you sold your allotment, then I don't know what they thought they were going to do, because there was really no place for them to go after that. But they sold, you know, they would sell like 40 acres and get $800 for it. And, you know, there was just about every allotment that was in the valley was acquired by the city of Los Angeles. And then they have they'd have a committee that would come and do an appraisal of your property, and then they would offer you the money. And a lot of people, they didn't have much at the time in the 1920s, so they saw that as a good thing, and they sold their allotments and they got the money. And then
question, Gerald, we have another question from our viewer. She'd like to learn the Nüümü language. Is there some place that she can do that?
You know, through the Owens Valley Career Development Center, we set up a language program, and they have and they put together material from the very elementary level on up to actual classes that they offer. Mm-hmm. And so I know that there have been non-natives who have have learned, you know, some of the language, and so, you know, they had those available on CD. You know, if you wanted to have, like, you know, a basic language course, those things are available. But it's, you know, it's, you know, one of the things that you find in terms of language, at least for me, is that, you know, things are so, you know, how families, they're extended families. And so maybe your family pronounced this a certain way, and it may not be the same for this other family. And, you know, when you think in terms of transportation, you know, back in those days, people didn't really move too much. And so some of the, you know, the dialect and some of the terms may be a little different. But it's good to know. It's you know, I'm learning things every day. I run across things and I try and talk to people, and I think what's really important, at least from my standpoint, is that, you know, when you look around this Payahüünadü, it's a place where people come to vacation. They come to, it's becoming a rock climbing place. And what I see now is that people start to name places, and so we're kind of losing that native connection. And I think it's important that we need to go back and reestablish those traditional names to places, because once you lose that, then you kind of lose, you know, that connection, and somebody else comes to kind of own that. You know, not by title, but people just kind of start calling places this, and they call places this when it's really not. That's not what it was called. And I think that's really important, so that people can kind of, people know that there were people here before white settlement. You know, that's important. So
do we want to give Monty one more try? I see he's lit. Monty, can you hear us? Hi, Monty.
I have a cell phone, and I'm also on the computer, and I think it's double.
Yes, I can hear a little feedback there. Do you want to give your 2 cents on the language revitalization or relationships between the Nisei and the Nüümü? I think we've lost him again.
I think we lost him.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to introduce Monica Embrey, who has recited a beautiful poem written for her grandmother. And Amara, do we have that available?
I do. I do.
Oh, Carly. Yes, thank you, Carly. Goddess of Tech.
Hello, my name is Monica Mariko Embrey, and I am the granddaughter of Su Kunitoni Embrey. And I'm going to read a poem today by her dear friend, fellow activist, and scholar, Michi Waglin. Sue, dreamer, tireless activist, we felt your passion in the bitter battle for the enshrinement of a landmark shame. We sense your constancy, strength, through the pilgrimages, emblazoning Manzanar on the national conscience. How does one celebrate such a woman of purpose, dedication, resolve, but to humbly record these inadequate lines? Sincere sentiments parading as poetry, simply to say, we thank you, we love you. Our indebtedness to you is boundless.
Carly, did you want to close the event? and introduce?
Well, we do have one more thing that we wanted to invite our audience to partake in. As the event closes up, we are going to play a clip of the Totsahoidu Dance Group. And with that, I would like to wrap up the evening's events by thanking the Totsahoidu Dance Group, our sponsors from the California State Library, our panelists, Bruce, Gerald, Murielle, Ann, and Amra, our facilitator, and Jeanne, and Monty. I'd also like to thank the Taiko drum group and everyone for joining us this evening for this wonderful talk. We'd like to remind everyone that the recording will be available on our advocates website at AICLS.org and on Facebook and on our YouTube. So from all of us and on behalf of the advocates, we hope you be safe and have a good night.
Thank you, Carly.
Take it away, Amra.
Thanks to everybody.
War dance song. Johanna, Johanna, Titten, 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 Johanna, Johanna, Titten. I said, Penasene Kimona, Holy Kimona, Johanna, Johanna, Titten. Johanna, Titten, Johanna, 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 Johanna, Titten.
I'm going to sing you folks a war dance song of our Indian tribe of Innu County. Azipenasane Yonane Kamana, Yona Yuana Tijini, Yona Yuana Tiji, Yona Yuana Tijini. Azipenasane Kamana, Yonane Kamana, Yona Yuana Tijini.
Amra, can you tell us a little bit about the Totsahoidu Dance Group?
Sure. So that's just, again, want to thank everybody for participating tonight. I know some of the questions weren't all answered, and unfortunately Monty was not able to get all the way in. We heard him for a split second, but we're appreciative of the efforts and everybody's work leading up to this point. We know we have strong histories within each of us, and when we're able to talk about it and express it, it only makes us remember things and you know, stronger as people, as Nisei people, as Nüümü people. So I'm appreciative. But the video that we just played was our Totsahoidu Nugadu, which is our war dance group, from past dancers to present dancers. And some of the recordings that were shared with me from Sean Brown, who's a student at, I'm going to say it wrong, Berkeley, I believe. And he shared an old Sam Kinney recording, as well as you heard Daryl Maddox, who's our current teacher. And he was a dancer when he was a child. And I may be getting all this wrong. I don't want to step on anybody's toes or offend anyone. And then the last woman singer, which we haven't heard a lot of feedback regarding women singing, or we kind of have heard some people say women aren't to sing the war dance song. So that was interesting that that archive recording came in and she was singing it. And unfortunately, it doesn't say who's singing it. But again, the purpose of that war dance, Totsahoidu war dance, is to cleanse the body, cleanse the spirit of our men that were going off to war. And this is just what I was told, but to help in that process to, you know, they talk about it now being post, what is it called? PTSD, I'm sorry, PTSD. And so getting their body, their spirit back to a healthy mindset. And so we're teaching those boys again, mostly today for a demonstration purpose, because we don't go to war. However, in connection with all that we've spoken about today, you know, that is something, not necessarily war as in killing and battling, but war for their livelihood, war for their people, war for their culture and their heritage and the things that, their language, you know, the things that we need to keep strong within our people. And when that mindset, and like Gerald was talking about earlier, when you know who you are and you know where your people come from and you know that those things have happened, those injustices have happened to your family and to your people, you're able to go forth with that clearer mindset of what can I do now, and how can I make my ancestors proud? How can I do it? Because that's what my ancestors would have done, and that's what our people continue to do, in a nutshell.
Okay, it looks like the facilitators and I, we noticed that there are some questions that are still unanswered. So I just wanted to kind of lift these up to the panelists since you're still on. We have some questions here. Can something be said about the interactions between the Native people and the Japanese during the internment period? This is open to any of the panelists.
Well, you know,
Go ahead, Gerald.
Well, you know, when I was one of the things that, I don't know how many Native people worked at Manzanar. I know that there were Native people from the valley that worked at Manzanar. And people would also come down and maybe they did odd jobs, or they would help with loading produce. I'm not sure, but I kind of think that they probably got along fairly well. I mean, at least with the connections that they had, even though they may be limited, but. I don't know if many of the internees that once the camp was over, they probably went back home, and so there isn't a large there isn't a remnant of the internees that remained here. So I think a lot of the Native people probably realized, what was happening there was, something that they were very familiar with. And, but they weren't in a position of power. And like was mentioned earlier, what people have to do is they really have to be involved politically to prevent things from happening. And I can't encourage that, enough, for people to really get involved and actually do the simplest thing, and that's to vote and get out and make their voices heard, even though sometimes they don't think about it, that their one vote matters, but it does. And that political involvement is very important if you're going to protect your rights. And so, I mean, I don't know if there was, it was probably, the relationship was probably limited. That would be my understanding.
Go ahead, Murielle.
Oh, unmute, Murielle. Unmute. Unmute, there you go.
I can speak of two interactions with the Native American peoples. One, which is more recent, like 5 years ago, I belonged to a group, civil rights group called the Japanese American Citizens League. And we have been taking a busload from the Sacramento area to Manzanar every year for the last 10 years. And it is a joint venture with the Muslim group called the Council on Arab-Islamic Relations. And I do know that Bruce Embrey and the group from LA also has connected, and they come in April when Manzanar holds their pilgrimage. And about 5 years ago, there was an incident. We stay at Bishop, not Bishop, but
yeah, Bishop.
Was it Bishop? Okay, sorry. And there was a bowling alley that did not allow us to participate because there was somebody in the group that looked Muslim. And so there was an incident, and the superintendent of Manzanar, Bernadette Johnson, helped us to have sort of an understanding with the bowling alley that, you know, this is racist and, you know, it's not good for business. And as a result of that, we made a connection with a dance group called the Okavaya. And I'm not sure whether it's the name of their tribe or whether it is a group, but we have an interchange. When we go to Manzanar, we do Obon dances, we have a Taiko drum group that comes, and then the Okavaya Indians dance for us, and we share a meal together. And then afterwards, we all make origami cranes, which is a symbol of peace, and we take it to the monument at Manzanar, at the cemetery. So that's a relationship that has become very close to our hearts. And when the Okavayas come to an Indian, what do you call it when they have the gathering? There's a name for it. So anyway, a powwow, right. In Sacramento, we go and, you know, we support them. The second story I'm going to tell is about Poston and Gila, Arizona. Two of the camps were put on Indian land. And when the government was looking for a place, you know, they're looking for federal land, and they went to the Indian nation and said, you know, we need a place. And the Indian nation voted no. And this was, remember, 1941, 1942. And if you recall, what Indian reservation had electricity? What Indian reservation had roads and infrastructure and a sewer system and water? I believe it was the Indian commissioner who, without their permission, had the two camps built there. The Army Corps of Engineers went, they built roads, they brought in electricity, they dug a reservoir and filled it with water from the Colorado River. They put in a sewage system. And then when the internees arrived, they said, there is enough water for 6 months. You will need to build and dig a canal from the Colorado River. It's only 8 miles that direction. And they brought heavy earth-moving machinery, and the internees built the canal, which brought water to the Indian nation in Gila, Arizona, and Poston. The second thing that the Japanese did, you know, they were very skilled farmers. The government allotment for food was 38 to 42 cents per person per day. And I mentioned earlier that that wasn't enough food, which is why so many of the babies died and the older people were not well. And finally, the government said, you know, we hadn't intended on feeding you for whatever the duration might be, we'll give you land and you grow your own food. Well, the sand in Arizona was once the bottom of an ocean, was filled with salt. The Japanese, I don't know who thought of it, but they built a dike around an area of land, and then they buried pipes 3 feet deep, and they flooded the land over and over until the salt had gone below the 3 feet. And Japanese farmers, you know, they taste the soil, and if it has too much salt, you know, nothing will grow in it. They also understood how to do crop rotation to put nutrients into the soil. I think they started with soybeans, something, whatever. If you go to the Gila Reservation today, the Indian nation has a canal that brings water. They also have built a $1 billion farming industry because they learned how to do that and reclaim the land. There is a video that was made called Passing Poston, and it is about the camp and the Japanese-American experience. But at the end, one of the Indian tribal chiefs talks about how his Indian nation profited from the tears of the Japanese and their presence at Gila, Arizona. So that's another connection.
Thank you, Murielle.
Murielle, while we have you unmuted, we have a question specifically for you, and I just wanted to raise that up for you. It's a question about, oh, I just lost it. If you could speak about, oh gosh, where did it go? Bernadette Johnson asked it.
I think she wanted me to speak about the orphans.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, John DeWitt was a racist, and he said nobody with one drop of Jap blood would be left in his territory, and did remove children from orphanages in mostly the Los Angeles area. And for whatever reason, you know, these were orphans, and they hired a Japanese American social worker to take care of them, and there was 101 of them. The youngest was 6 months old. And at least in 1 or 2 cases, these orphans who were part Japanese, and some were, you know, 100% Japanese, but many of them were only half Japanese, had been placed in foster care. And the families said, oh, you know, we have a Japanese child, but we're not leaving because we're white, so you don't have to take this child. DeWitt took them anyway. He removed them from these foster care families and stuck them inside a compound inside Manzanar, separated from the rest of the folks. And it was called the Children's Camp. You should Google that and find out about it. And there have been stories. There is a book called Twice Orphaned, meaning they got, you know, their parents died or something happened and they were placed in an orphanage, and then they were removed from that orphanage and placed inside a prison, inside another prison. And the social worker was interviewed a long time ago. She lived in Berkeley, and she was very proud. And she said, none of my children died. And when you think about that, think about the high ratio of infant mortality and how under those conditions, those harsh conditions in camp, and not having adequate food the first year, there was illness. And the old and the young, of course, suffered and died. And there were all kinds of things. Think about it, depression. And there was no privacy. I hope that you have a chance to go to Manzanar. The staff at Manzanar, under the leadership of Superintendent Bernadette Johnson, has program and provided facilities that help you understand what happened. And I hope, and I know that there is a section that talks about the Native people that live there. And this is where I learned some of the information that I know about what happened to that land, from the original residents to, you know, what it is now, which is a national park and a wonderful museum.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think
you have a question, Ann. I saw you raise your hand.
Oh, okay.
No, I was just going to add that in terms of connections between Japanese Americans and Japanese Americans and Nüümü during the years of incarceration, that fishing was always comes up within the community as a point of intersections between people, because I think that a lot of young men sort of secretly, Donnell makes comments about it in the film, but when I've spoken to folks in Big Pine and Lone Pine and also in Bishop, it's like elders, there are stories within the community of how, you know, they would help Japanese Americans to go fishing and guide them to the best fishing spots. And I think it's really symbolic in both communities of what's important, of being on the land, and of feeding yourselves despite being incarcerated for the Japanese Americans, but also for the Native, for the Nüümü. It's like this is their land and this is the land providing food for them. So I just wanted to make that comment. And I think Bernadette also wanted to mention that more recently, I mean, Bruce can speak to this in a much better way than I can, but I think a lot of communities came together around the solar ranch that was proposed, you know, that GWP was trying to establish across from Manzanar on the other side of the valley. And so, you know, Japanese Americans and, you know, folks all over the valley, really, indigenous folks really came together to sort of fight that and hope, and, you know, have put that on hold very successfully. Although this may come back to life. Bruce, you can say more, but I just thought I would mention that.
Well, I could speak a little bit about it, but it really was the leadership of Kathy Bancroft that made a lot of this happen, I think, and some of the people in the Owens Valley Committee. But the Manzanar Committee took on the fight to stop what the DWP euphemistically called a solar ranch, which was going to be this massive industrial solar array right across from Manzanar on land that had not even been done any research or had been investigated at all. And they were just simply going to create this massive industrial solar farm. And so together with everyone in the Owens Valley, we were able to lobby here in Los Angeles and create enough controversy here and in the Owens Valley so that the DWP actually backed off and tabled it. And we had a number of survivors from camp who testified and brought their moral authority to the table, and were able to shame, I think, effectively and pressure effectively the DWP to back off. But there's a number, I can't speak so much about interactions between Native people and the Nikkei or Nisei during the war period, but you know, we've been going to Manzanar for 51 years, and in the course of returning to tell our story, we actually were able to appreciate and understand the true history of the valley. And consequently, what happened from that, I think, is at our pilgrimage each year, we have a land acknowledgement and a speaker from the valley. Kathy Bancroft has been speaking the last few years, and it allows our attendees to understand that they're standing on native land, and that they're standing in an area that has a rich and deep history. And it's not just our 4 years or so that defines this area. And along those lines, I think my mother really did appreciate the rich history of the valley, And so when she was successfully, or the committee was able to successfully lobby to create the Manzanar National Historic Site, Congress developed an advisory commission. And the advisory commission to build the National Historic Site was not just Japanese American incarcerees or survivors and their descendants. It actually was mandated from the very beginning to include everyone whose history had developed on this land. So Vernon Miller and Richard Stewart were two of the Native representatives on that commission, that congressional commission, and they helped guide the creation of the Manzanar National Historic Site. So we actually look at Manzanar not as our site. We look at it as a site of conscience. We look at it as a civil rights site, one that should tell the story of everyone who was involved in this valley and what happened, the true story about what happened. So in that sense, we see Manzanar not as ours in any stretch, by any stretch, but we see it as a site of conscience that should speak to and educate everyone about what happened over the years there.
Great. Oh, I'm sorry, did I interrupt, Jeanne?
No, thank you to Bruce. I appreciate the information.
Okay. There are some other questions, but it is 7:30. It is almost 7:35. So would we be okay with wrapping it up at this time? And really, really closing up for sure? Go ahead, Jeanne.
I agree with the shout out to Kathy Bancroft and Bernadette Johnson for assisting us with this project. Thumbs up.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Carly. You were amazing. And
You're welcome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. Again, I just wanted to thank the panelists once more before we close, for sure, and for the attendees for hanging in there with us. It was a long session. There were a lot of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But what that tells me is perhaps we should try to do this again sometime.
I urge all teachers to invite speakers, whether it's the Native American speakers, the Japanese, whoever, that you learn about history through the stories of people and their culture.
Hear, hear. Okay.
All right. Once again, everyone, good night, and thank you for joining us. Be safe.
Be well, stay well, everybody.
Yes, yes.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.